Perturabo, also known as the Lord of Iron, is the Primarch of the 4th Legion of the Legionis Astartes, the Iron Warriors. Perturabo was a warrior who was noted for not only his brutality in combat, but also for his cold and logical mindset, in addition to his tactical prowess, especially in the art of siege warfare. While Perturabo was often regarded by many of his brothers as being little more than a bitter and resentful man, the Lord of Iron was nonetheless a technological genius and, somewhat surprisingly, an artistic and architectural savant. Indeed, during the course of the Great Crusade, Perturabo would utilize his talents to fashion a number of beautiful and delicately intricate gifts for his brothers, such as a golden clockwork lion for Lionel Johnson of the Dark Angels and a celestial timepiece for Rabute Gilliman of the Ultramarines. However, Perturabo's craftsmanship was not merely reserved for constructing clockwork automata, chronometers, and other such trinkets, for the Lord of Iron would also design and modify various pieces of weaponry and armor to utilize upon the field of battle, the most notable of which being his Logos armor, which in itself was a heavily customized suit of cataphracti Terminator plate. During the later years of the Crusade, when Perturabo's brother, Horus Lupercal, the Primarch of the Sons of Horus and Warmaster of the Imperium, decided to rebel against the Emperor and instigate the events of the Horus Heresy, the Lord of Iron would choose to align himself with his brother, due in part to his resentment to his father, whom, in Perturabo's eyes, failed to appreciate the sacrifices made by both he and his legion. Horus, by contrast, claimed to not only respect but value the contributions made by the Iron Warriors during the course of the Great Crusade, and in time Perturabo would be appointed as the Warmaster's second-in-command, in addition to becoming one of his closest allies and confidants. When Horus's forces made their final push towards the Imperial throne world Terra, Perturabo was not only responsible for directing the bulk of the Traitor Legion Armada as it battled its way through the Sol system, but the Lord of Iron would effectively assume command of all Traitor Legion assets upon Terra itself following the commencement of the siege, due to Horus himself being preoccupied with his own spiritual and psychic battles against the Emperor. This would result in Perturabo facing off against his loyalist brother Rogul Dawn, the Primarch of the Imperial Fists and the new Imperial Warmaster in all but name, in a proverbial game of chess, as each Primarch made move and countermove against one another during the course of the conflict. For Dawn, much like Perturabo, was also an expert in siege warfare, making him the perfect choice to oversee the defense of the Imperial Palace. As the siege dragged on, Perturabo would eventually discover an apparent gap within the Loyalists' defenses, a structural weakness located beneath the Saturine Gate, which appeared to have been, somewhat uncharacteristically, overlooked by Dawn's forces. Perturabo was no fool, however, for he believed that there was no way that Dawn would have been so blasé in fortifying the Imperial Palace, and thus began to suspect that this supposed gap was, in actuality, an enticingly baited trap. Not wanting to lead his own legion into a potential trap, Perturabo would instead allow the Emperor's Children Legion to launch a diversionary assault against the walls, while a strike force from the Sons of Horus Legion, led by First Captain Ezekiel Abaddon, would tunnel beneath the Saturine Gate in order to take the Loyalists unaware. As Perturabo had suspected, the gap beneath the Saturine Gate was indeed a carefully orchestrated ambush, and those warriors that had infiltrated beneath the palace would end up being utterly decimated by the Loyalists. Over time, however, Perturabo would begin to grow increasingly disheartened and embittered by the fact that his allies had fully succumbed to the corrupting influence of chaos, feeling that the entire conflict had lost the simple purity that came with pitting rival Space Marine legions against one another, and had instead devolved into a war of monsters, beasts, and other such foul abominations. Eventually, Horus would order for Perturabo to disperse his warriors over multiple fronts across the siege, before revealing that his position and duties were to be taken over by Mortarion, the demon Primarch of the Death Guard Legion. This would prove to be the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back, and in his anger, Perturabo would order for his forces to withdraw from Terra and abandon the siege altogether, although a smaller number of Iron Warriors would, for one reason or another, continue to fight for the War Master's cause. Enraged, Horus would order for roughly half of the Traitor Legion fleet to set off in pursuit of Perturabo's forces, a decision that would allow for a small group of Dark Angels under the command of Captain Paladin Causwain to make planetfall and capture the Hollow Mountain, where the Astronomicon was located, which in turn would make it easier for Loyalist reinforcements from the Ultramarines and Dark Angels Legion to navigate the dangers of warp space in order to reach Terra, although both legions would ultimately arrive far too late for their actions to affect the outcome of the siege. Regardless, Perturabo's desertion had undoubtedly struck a blow against Horus's forces, as the War Master had not only lost his siege master, but also a substantial number of troops with which to besiege the Imperial Palace. So what could have happened if Perturabo, and by extension the majority of the Iron Warriors Legion, chose to not abandon Terra? The first and most obvious change would be that in regards to the number of additional warriors that the traitors would have at their disposal. Indeed, according to Horus Heresy Book 3, Extermination, the Iron Warriors Legion, at their peak, had somewhere between 150,000 to 180,000 Astartes within their ranks. However, due to various factors such as battlefield attrition and desertion, it's reasonable to assume that the 4th Legion would not be operating at full strength, although they would nonetheless have access to a substantial number of troops. The presence of the Iron Warriors would in turn effectively counteract the desertion of the Emperor's children who chose to abandon the siege following the assault upon the Saturnine Gate, and instead turn their attention towards Terra's civilian population, costing Horus roughly 110,000 Astartes in the process. However, instead of concentrating the bulk of the Legion's assets to one particular location, the Iron Warriors would more than likely be used to reinforce multiple fronts as per Horus's orders, which could potentially limit the 4th Legion's overall effectiveness in the conflict. In either case, this would still result in a much higher number of Astartes infantry, tanks and artillery being unleashed upon the Loyalists, which could very well see the defenders sustaining an even greater number of casualties over time, especially given the fact the Iron Warriors are noted to be both siege warfare and trench warfare specialists. In addition, because the Iron Warriors in this instance would not have abandoned the siege, which in turn would mean that Horus would not have dispatched half of his fleet in pursuit of Perturabo's forces, this would result in the Traitor Legion Armada in orbit of Terra remaining more or less at full strength. As a result, this would make it much harder, if not completely impossible, for Causwain's Dark Angels to break through the Traitor Legion blockade in order to make planetfall, meaning that the Hollow Mountain, and by extension the Astronomicon, would more than likely remain under Horus's control. This would also mean that the actions of Vasicella, a demon that had corrupted the very choir of the Astronomicon, would continue uninterrupted, resulting in Loyalist forces being mentally bombarded with the demon's corrupting influence, driving many of Terra's human defenders to a state of suicidal despair and to ultimately take their own lives, thinning the ranks of the Loyalists little by little. Not only this, but if Perturabo had decided to remain upon Terra, then Horus would have an incredibly skilled and tactically proficient general at his disposal. After all, as mentioned earlier, Perturabo was more or less in command of all Traitor Legion assets upon Terra prior to his departure. One of the reasons as to why Perturabo was such an effective commander, in addition to being a siege warfare specialist, is that out of all the traitor Primarchs that were able to reach Terra, the Lord of Iron was the only one who could claim to hold some semblance of sanity due to being uncorrupted by the powers of the warp. Angron, the demon Primarch of the World Eaters, for instance, had effectively devolved into a mindless, destructive beast, becoming little more than a weapon to point and unleash upon the War Master's foes. Fulgrim, the demon Primarch of the Emperor's children, had become increasingly self-obsessed and debased, and would in fact abandon the conflict along with the rest of his legion, due to the siege, in his eyes, no longer being fun. Magnus the Red, the Primarch of the Thousand Suns, would be banished into the depths of the warp shortly after his ascension to demonhood, after being beaten to near death by Vulcan, the Primarch of the Salamanders. Even Horus himself would begin to grow increasingly detached from the realities of the material realm, as his connection to both the warp and the ruinous powers continued to grow ever stronger. The only other traitor Primarch to take part in the siege who could arguably be considered somewhat sane would be Mortarion, and even then, the demon Primarch of the Death Guard would find himself banished from the material realm, after being decapitated by Jagatai Khan, the Primarch of the White Scars. Towards the end of the siege itself, the only traitor Primarchs that would remain active in any sort of capacity would be Horus and Angron. If Perturabo had chosen to remain upon Terra, then the Lord of Iron, as one of the few remaining traitor Primarchs, could very well have served as a rallying point for traitor Legion forces. Since the Loyalists were gradually forced further and further back towards the heart of the Imperial Palace in order to hold out against their foes, this could even lead to a situation where Perturabo himself may have led the final charge upon the Sanctum Imperialis. In this particular situation, not only would the traitors have a higher number of troops to unleash upon the defenders, but the mere presence of another Primarch, beings that are akin to demigods, on the front lines could very well have tipped the scales in the traitors' favor, potentially allowing them to overwhelm the Loyalists before the Emperor could enact his final, desperate gambit to end the war altogether, where he would teleport aboard Horus's flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, and slay the War Master in single combat. If this were indeed the case, then the siege could very well have ended in a traitor victory, although whether or not Horus's forces could have withstood the wrath of an encroaching and vengeful Ultramarines legion is another matter entirely. Regardless as to how events could have potentially played out, it is likely that Perturabo's decision to abandon the siege was the very moment that led to the downfall of the traitor legions, meaning that, somewhat surprisingly, the Lord of Iron may very well have been the unwitting savior of the Imperium. What do you think? Leave a comment below, and thanks for watching.